So welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you were able to join us for today's Mineta Transportation Institute Research Snaps webinar. My name is Hillary Nixon and I serve as the Deputy Executive Director for MTI. MTI is the U.S. Department of Transportation funded University Transportation Center at San Jose State University. Our mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. During today's webinar, if you have any questions for our presenters, you can submit them through the conference Q&A or chat feature. We are recording this webinar and the link to view it will be available shortly after the webinar on our website and social media pages. The focus of our webinar today is forthcoming MTI research that looks at the specific characteristics, policies, and practices, as well as the institutional characteristics that make a high-functioning, world-class metropolitan transit system. A series of case studies from 10 metropolitan areas in Europe, Canada, and Australia are used to identify these success factors across a set of 4 main categories. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michelle DeRobertis. Dr. DeRobertis is an MTI Research Associate and Principal at Transportation Choices for Sustainable Communities. She is a licensed traffic and civil engineer in California, specializing in bicycle, pedestrian, and sustainable transportation issues. Michelle, I think I will run the slideshow from my computer due to the technical difficulties we will have. So if you just let me know when to advance the slides, I will advance the slides for you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, all right, so we're beginning. Okay. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank MTI for funding this research, and also thanks to my co-researchers, Chris Farrell and Rick Lee and John Eels. Next slide. The research was to look at metropolitan area-wide transit features. What we think makes this research unique was that we did not focus on individual agencies or modes, but rather on the public transit system of the entire region and how it all works together. Our methodology was to look at 10 case studies from outside the United States that all had high transit ridership. Not just their major city, but also high transit mode share for the region as a whole. Next slide. The goal was to determine what, if anything, these 10 areas had in common. The findings are not meant to be statistically valid, but we think it can offer some lessons for those metropolitan areas that would like to improve the regional mode share and the relationship between the modes, particularly, but not only, in areas that have more than one transit system or transit operator. The 3 areas that we looked into for commonalities were institutional and structural features, customer apparent features, and financial support or subsidy. Next slide. The metropolitan areas chosen were from Western countries with similar culture to the United States, such as wealth and car ownership. We deliberately avoided the largest cities, such as London and Paris. We tried to choose those areas that, as mentioned previously, had higher transit mode share than other locations. So, for example, we chose Milan over Turin and Stockholm over Copenhagen. We also wanted to have a variety in terms of regional population and major city size, as well as some polycentric and monocentric areas. So from Europe, we chose Lyon, France, Stuttgart and Frankfurt in Germany, Milan, Italy, Barcelona, Spain, Stockholm, Sweden. And from outside Europe, we chose Sydney and Perth in Australia and Vancouver and Toronto in Canada. Next slide. So I will now briefly present our findings in our 3 focus areas of structure, customer-facing characteristics, and funding. First, despite the variation in political structure among our 10 metropolitan areas, that is from 1 to many counties to no county level at all in some countries, all 10 case study metropolitan areas have an entity that is responsible for regional transit coordination. This could either be a consortium of cities and counties or one specifically created agency, usually created by the governmental political body. We call this the RTC, the Regional Transit Coordinator. Next slide. In our case studies, there were 3 basic structures of the RTC. This does not mean that there aren't other models, but these are the 3 that came up in our 10 case studies. First, the RTC is a coordination-only agency. The second model is that the coordination agency is also the operator of the regional rail transit system. And the third model is what we call complete consolidation. One agency does everything. Let's look at how these three look in a little bit more detail. Next slide. This is where you're gonna have to click a lot, Hillary, sorry about this. The first model, click, we call coordination only. Click again. The RTC is an alliance of separate transit agencies, and the RTC has specific responsibilities to coordinate the many separate local and regional transit systems. Notably, in our case studies, these separate transit systems are departments of a city or a province, or even a city-owned company. This alliance may be voluntarily entered or created by state legislation. And examples from our case studies are Stuttgart, Frankfurt, Lyon, Milan, and Barcelona. Note that I am using the name of the major city, but the RTC actually has a different name as shown in the logos below. Next slide. Model 2 is that the RTC also provides regional rail and bus transit systems. Click again. This was the case for Metrolinx, click again, in Toronto, but our research also found this to be the case in Manchester, England. Next slide. The third model was consolidation. It was complete consolidation of all transit operations under one single agency. The RTC coordinates and manages and operates all public transit modes in the entire region. This entity is almost always a governmental unit above the municipality, that is, a county or a state. For example, in Stockholm, Stockholm County, and also several counties in Sweden are the RTC. It is a state in Australia where the agency of an agency of the state of New South Wales operates the transit in Greater Perth, and an agency of the state of Western Australia, I said that wrong, New South Wales operates transit in Greater Sydney, and an agency of the state of Western Australia operates the transit in Greater Perth. One variation on this structure was in Vancouver, where the province of British Columbia created a new regional agency, a quasi-governmental level, to be the RTC, which is now known as TransLink. Whether or not this is because British Columbia doesn't have counties is beyond the scope of our research. Next slide. But there are many variations, even for complete consolidation. It's not as simple as it seems. For example, it was the existing county of Stockholm that became the RTC and the transit operator of the modes in the county. Whereas in Vancouver, as I mentioned before, provincial law created a new quasi-governmental agency at the regional level. And in Australia, the state gradually took over the provision of public transit. And there was an evolution for all of these cases. That is, there were many steps to get to where they are today. For example, by one definition, Stockholm really began consolidating in 1915, culminating in 1967 when they created their county-wide RTC. If you're interested in all this evolution, you can read our report, where there's a brief summary, and also sometimes these RTCs are really good about highlighting this on their own websites. But I would just like to point out one other particularly interesting development in the case of Perth, where it first created a Metropolitan-Areawide transit agency, which was subsequently subsumed into the state-level agency it is today. Another interesting finding, which I don't have time to go into, was sometimes we found that in some regions, first there was regional transit coordination, and then that led to regional government coordination. And in other cases, there was regional government consolidation that led to regional transit coordination. Next slide. Speaking of evolution and timelines, I would just add a few last things about these RTCs that happen with both the coordination model and the consolidation model. We found it interesting that most metropolitan areas have been doing regional transit coordination for decades, particularly all of our European case studies. In our case study, Stockholm was the first, right after they heard about Hamburg in the 1960s. Then they consolidated all their transit under the county in 1967. In the 70s, other places started getting into it. Stuttgart and the Australian cities began regional coordination. Milan also began one level of fare coordination at this time. Sydney's evolution seems to be the most protracted. It began in 1972, but there were major reorganizations in 1980 and 1988, and culminating in the creation of the new Transport for New South Wales, as I mentioned, as a state agency in 2011. In the 1980s, Lyon created its RTC, and there was another flurry in the 1990s when three of our case studies began regional coordination, that is Frankfurt, Barcelona, and Vancouver. The relative newcomer to regional coordination was Toronto, and depending on how you define it though, City of Toronto began a type of coordination much earlier. So basically, the year specified in this chart is the year that region-wide coordination began. And although one could quibble as to what constitutes the real start of regional coordination, a key point is that all areas had a series of evolutionary steps, maybe before the state and definitely beyond this date. And these steps included expansion in either their duties and responsibilities and or their geographic area or both. And in some cases, there was even major reorganization of their governing boards. Another key point is that the development of a functional RTC more often than not took years, and there were several, again, the key point is that the development of the functional RTC more often than not took years, and there were several steps and reorganizations before they got to where they are today. In fact, the most recent change in one of our RTCs was in Milan, Italy in 2016, due to the impetus of a law passed by the region of Lombardy. Next slide, please. So the second aspect of regional transit we'd like to talk about and that we investigated was customer apparent features, what we as transit passengers experience. In today's webinar, I will touch on just two of these customer apparent features, transit supply and fare policy. Click first, supply. We found that overall transit supply in these 10 areas was excellent, which was clearly to be expected. But what do we mean by supply? We used three measures. Click geographic extent, click frequency, and temporal extent, that is the service throughout the day. And how does this work in practice? We will talk about Milan as an illustration, which you can see in the background of the slide. It has a city population of 1.3 million and a metropolitan population of about 5 million. It has light rail, subway, and suburban rail commuter lines, which you can see on this slide. And just looking at the suburban rail system, since our report was a regionally focused level, we noticed that they have 12 suburban train lines that run 6 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week, and they run 10-minute to 30-minute headways minimum through that entire time. So that means even as late as 11 p.m. or early weekend morning or mid-Saturday, the maximum wait time for a train is 30 minutes. Contrast this with many areas in the US where there is only suburban rail service during the peak hour, and sometimes it's only in the peak direction. Next slide. You might have to click a couple of times to get, there we go. Another aspect of customer apparent features that we looked into was fare policy. Most of our areas had a single fare structure across all modes and operators. This was not only the case in areas with consolidation, but also in the areas with multiple operators and coordination. In fact, two of the places that have not fully embraced this fare policy were where they had full consolidation. So consolidation is not necessary for this policy. Only coordination is needed. So what does a single fare policy mean? It means that there's only one ticket needed, regardless of how many different modes and how many operators are used. They price the journey from origin to destination, not the individual modal trip. I call this mode blind or operator blind. You could also call it seamless. Other fare findings were that, in general, public transit is affordable and there are multiple policies to encourage transit use. Click. Next slide. So how does this work in practice? What I'm calling operator blind. All transit modes and operators accept the same ticket or pass. There's no need to obtain or purchase a transfer or to purchase different monthly passes from different operators. One single journey ticket is typically valid for 90 minutes, but the time varies, as you can see on the right. And in that time, you can use as many modes as you need to get to where you need to go. You can take the bus to the train, and you take the train, and when you get to where you're going, you take the light rail or the bus when you get to the downtown. Several operators, several cities, but one fare, one ticket. Again, passes are encouraged, and all modes and operators use the same pass, whether it's the bus, the subway, the commuter rail, the light rail, the funiculars. There are many options for passes. There are day passes, multi-day passes, weekly passes, monthly passes, annual passes. There are discounts for students up to age 26, recognizing that university students also have limited incomes. Children under 12 are free or deeply discounted. And on weekends, monthly pass holders can often bring the family or can bring a friend for free. Click. Next slide. This is where I might need to click several times. It just
Okay.
glitch in the system.
There we go. Sorry about that, Michelle.
The last issue we looked at was the funding of our transit in our metropolitan areas. The subsidies varied, but of course there are subsidies. No time to discuss the variations of conclusions, but they unapologetically fund public transit. Second is that despite how good their networks are compared to the US, they still have future plans to expand their rail networks. Another thing is that the coordination agency ensures that the long-term planning and funding is also coordinated. And there's a financial commitment, both past and present, to building and maintaining the infrastructure and the operations to support it. Next slide. So in conclusion, all 10 case studies had a Metropolitan-Area-wide regional transit coordinating body. And while overall the evolution of these various RTCs happened in different ways and at different times, the end result was regional coordination. We have illustrated this above, and we show that how all our public transit metropolitan areas proceeded from a mix of public and private to a mix of publicly owned transit agencies, and then there was a fork. The evolution proceeded to either coordination entity or a consolidation entity, but both appear to be equally effective. Next slide. Other conclusions. All cases studies had some degree of fare integration, but most had complete region-wide fare integration. Transit service from a regional perspective was abundant and affordable in all cases. There was an excellent existing supply and a commitment to expand the range of rail and rapid transit. And lastly, funding is key to this. The laws that created the new RTC agencies also ensured that total transit dollars increased and that transit funding comes from a variety of sources: parking fees, developer fees, gas taxes, and more. And last slide. In sum, the research shows that even in metropolitan areas with multiple actors, multiple system owners and operators, efficient and high mode share public transit can be obtained at the regional level by regional coordination and proper funding. A steady, sufficient, reliable funding stream is fundamental to world-class public transportation. And thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so very much, Michelle. I really appreciate it. I know that certainly in recent months, there's been an awful lot of talk and discussion about the role of transit and particularly the future of transit. So I wanted to get to some questions. If you're an attendee at the webinar and you have questions, feel free to submit them through the Q&A option. But I also have some questions that had been submitted as individuals registered. And so I wanted to start with a couple of those. The first one, actually, I want to punt a little bit because there was a question submitted by an attendee asking if there are lessons learned from what Michelle and the team did for successful implementation of traffic signal preemption systems in urban areas. Well, you've anticipated a future research that is actually underway with Michelle and her team. This is a project that is funded through Caltrans, California Department of Transportation. So stay tuned. That will be published here in the coming months and will be available on MTI's website. But other questions that I want to tackle with Michelle. So there was a question that talked about with the role of rideshare, micromobility, automated vehicles, both passenger and delivery in our future. What lessons can we learn from the study that you did on international metropolitan areas and how they may have leveraged new technology at the time to help achieve their transit goals, or how you see the future with the blend between technology and traditional transit going?
Well, let's see. Micromobility did not come up explicitly in our research, but it is apparent to us that a regional transit coordinator could have a major role in developing and integrating such modes into the public transit umbrella that serves the whole region, instead of each individual agency trying to figure it out for themselves. I do know, for example, that many metropolitan areas, the same smart card that you use to ride transit is the same card that you use for bike share. That was the case where I was in Italy, and I've seen it in France. So there's definitely precedent for integrating micromobility modes into that type of technology and application. And in terms of where to place different individual stations, I think that's definitely a role that a regional transit coordinator would assist on.
So thank you. So there was a question submitted. There's actually two questions. The first one I will answer very quickly. The research paper is just in the final publication stages. So there was a question about when it will be available. So it will be available on our website fairly soon, and we will send it out to all individuals who've participated here on the webinar. But there was another question about transit financing. And Michelle, could you speak to some exemplar models of transit financing, and then focus on the sustainability to ensure that it provided a steady, sustainable stream over time?
We found two that we thought were remarkable to look at for best practices. One was in Vancouver. So when they created this, they don't have counties in British Columbia, but they knew that they needed to think regionally for lots of issues, and transit was one of them. So they created a regional quasi-governmental agency that actually has taxation authority. So it's not just dependent on other government bodies to say, okay, you can have this particular share of the property tax. They can look at the region and do parking fees, property taxes, sales taxes. I might be getting the details wrong, but they do have some taxation authority. And when they created the transit agency, they made sure that it was properly funded through a variety of taxes. And Stockholm, we found that, I'm not exactly sure the source of all their funds, but they seem to fund transit at a higher level than the other agencies. And of course, they also have a really great mode share in Stockholm.
Great. Thank you. So there was a question about kind of the thresholds and performance measures that you use to determine success. I wonder, I know that there's probably a lot of them. It may be difficult to go through all of them. And again, we'll be sending out the report as soon as it's finalized. But could you maybe summarize some of the highlights of the performance measures and thresholds that you use to determine success?
The primary threshold that we used was to look at metropolitan areas that had a high regional transit mode share. So we self-selected areas that already were, that we determined successful, and our single definition was mode share. And we wanted to use that because we just wanted to get right to the heart of, you know, if we just looked at areas with great transit mode share, how did they get there and what do they have? And we made sure that we didn't just look at the major city, because of course, if you're looking at, especially Europe, major cities have high transit mode share compared to the US, but we looked at the metropolitan area mode share. And looking at that, we also wanted to kind of control for other things like car ownership. So if car ownership is super low in some countries, that's going to, you know, what's influencing what? Do you have low car ownership because transit modes are so good, or do you have high transit mode share because hardly anyone owns a car? So we had that sort of as a balancing thing. But our success was basically, let's find some high, well-used transit systems, and then once we had that, look at what they had in common.
Thanks, Michelle. So there was a question about, so for regions where you don't have full consolidation, so you still have a variety of operators within the regional area. So did you look at what was done to ensure equitable or even adequate funding across all of the operators within the consortium?
That we think is a great topic for future research. There were several models. It's the go-to model in Germany. Like over 60 metropolitan areas in Germany have this model, and it's what spread to Stockholm. Although Stockholm went with they borrowed the idea and then created a consolidation under the county. So, but in areas like Milan and Lyon and Barcelona, they still have each individual county and state and major city still operates their own transit system, and they have this consortium that they all either voluntarily or by law are part of. And redistributing the funding is part of the duty of this regional transit coordinator. And I think that's where we in the US would be like, nobody wants to give up their piece of the pie. And I think it's a good topic for future research. I think that the pie actually grew. So you're not fighting over the smaller pie. It's like, we'll all coordinate and we'll all make sure that the government makes sure that they have the funding to at least maintain the service that they do have and provide more service. So.
So a couple other questions. Was there any, we've focused here on international examples. Was there any consideration to study US cities such as DC or New York City, or was the emphasis really at looking at what we could learn here in the United States from international examples?
We definitely were considering looking at the United States, but then we decided that just to keep it simple, we would only look at international and then see what we could learn internationally. There may be, we've heard of a few stories that might be where some areas in the US are further along this road than others, and there probably definitely are some lessons to be learned from them. But at this point, we just decided to look at international studies.
Great. So you'd also mentioned in your presentation that affordable was an important element of the success for these metropolitan public transit in these metropolitan areas. And we have a question kind of asking, well, what was the average cost of a ride in some of these cities converted to US dollars? So for example, in Milan, if you converted their transit fare to US dollars, what would a single ride cost?
On average, it was about €2, so a little bit more than $2. But where it really gets affordable is when you get your monthly passes and your weekly passes, especially and annual passes. It's affordable like you wouldn't believe. In fact, the region of Lombardy has Milan is just one area of Lombardy. The whole region of Lombardy has maybe 8 different metropolitan areas. You can buy a pass for the whole state of Lombardy for $107 a month. And for that pass, €107, excuse me, so $125 a month, you can ride every public transit in the whole state of Lombardy. That basically is a level of affordability I haven't seen anywhere in the US.
Great. Thank you. Very interesting. So we probably have time for one final question. And there was a question that had been submitted during registration that talks about the emphasis among transit professionals in capturing those choice riders rather than and while at the same time maybe possibly ignoring service enhancements for captive riders. And I was wondering, did your research touch on this at all, or other work that you may have done that kind of looks at this difference between going with capturing new choice riders or service enhancements for captive riders?
I think that's a really good question, and I think that is a different perspective. They're from what we gleaned from our research is that they were going for both, actually. They didn't choose one or the other. When I did research in Stuttgart on another project 10 years ago, they really wanted to go improve their light rail system kind of for those plus riders, the ones that had cars to, the wealthier riders, but they didn't ignore the system for the rest of the population. So they wanted to have both levels of high quality light rail to get the what do you call them, non-transit dependent riders, as well as the other ones. And a way to serve the captive dependent ones is to just have service that's good on the weekends, late at night, frequent during the day. Not everyone has a 9-to-5 job, so who's more likely to want and needs to work, commute on transit at 10 o'clock at night? It might be the service worker. And by having good transit at those off hours is a way to make sure that you're providing good transit for the captive riders.
Great. Well, Michelle, thank you so much. We are at 10:30, so we're going to wrap up here. I really appreciate all the work that you and your team put into this project. As I've mentioned, the full report will be published fairly soon to our website, and we will send this out to all attendees. And in addition, if you would like to get your next dose of research in 30 minutes or less, our next Research Snap webinar will be on August 20th at 10 a.m. and registration details are on the screen. We thank you all very, very much for participating and hope you have a great rest of your day. So thank you.